Hello, I'm George Mason, host of Good God, Conversations that Matter about Faith in Public Life. And today we'll be talking with an ex-Navy SEAL who fought the enemy on the battlefield and won more times than not, but almost didn't succeed in his own battle with depression. He'll be talking about how faith helped him cope and overcome. Welcome to Good God, Conversations that Matter about Faith in Public Life. I'm George Mason, and I'm happy to introduce to you and to welcome to the program today Stephen Holley. Stephen, glad to have you.
Thank you for having me.
I should say at the beginning of this program that although you are the founder, co-founder, and CEO of Carry the Load, and you own your own business, Six Sight, which is an adventure wear and hunting gear kind of company. We've known each other since you were a kid.
I think we determined earlier it was about 10 or 11 years old.
Well, and you were in Wilshire Baptist Church, where I've been pastor since 1989, and continue to be pastor to your mother and to your sisters and their families as well. And I had the privilege of performing your wedding. It's almost 14 years ago, I think.
14 years next month.
It's incredible. So we've had a lot of similar experiences. You and I have experienced things, common experiences through being college football players and things of that nature. So we've had a lot through the years to talk about. But I think this program is called Good God, and we also want to talk about people's faith journeys, what that's been like, not just the things we do for good in the community, but also how that's animated by our own spiritual journey and understanding of faith. And because you grew up at our church, I'm interested to know from your earliest recollections of faith over time, what kind of changes have you experienced? Because everyone's faith does change and should change in some way. So I'd like folks to hear that about your journey.
For me personally, having been baptized at I think fourth grade. Mm-hmm. It's probably the year before you came.
Yes, just before I came. Right.
Bruce McKeever.
That's right, my predecessor. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And growing up in a Christian household, going to church, being involved with the youth group, right. My faith and spirituality was always an important part of my life. And going away to the military, serving in the SEAL teams, I would tell you, for me personally, my faith journey it ebbed and flowed. And there were times where it was very strong. There were other times where it wasn't as strong. I would tell you personally, a big step for me was when my wife and I started having kids. Mm-hmm. And
which you never have stopped. It's like you have 5 now, right?
Right, we have 5. Yeah. Uh-huh. We've figured out how that keeps happening. But yeah, I think I would argue that for most people, when you have your first child and you figure out, oh my goodness, this little human I'm in charge of now, and I think the funny joke that my wife and I always used to tell other married people that we're expecting is, you're going to figure out just how much free time you've got right now. And so when all of a sudden when you have a child and you figure out the amount of time and sacrifice that it takes to raise a child, I think that sacrifice, and when you tie it back to your spirituality, those things are one and the same. Mm-hmm. And as we've continued to have kids, and now having 5, and raising our kids in the church, that for me was a big step. I'll tell you, another big step for me was, being in the Navy, coming back into the corporate world, and then really struggling with being fulfilled. Mm-hmm. And again, I always thought that transition, some of the things issues I was dealing with, I thought could be solved by the amount of money I was making. Mm-hmm. And when that happened, I thought, okay, it must be more money, and never being fulfilled. Mm-hmm. and falling into the trap that many of us fall in, as we live in our country, especially Dallas, Texas. It's a very easy bear trap to step in.
Right.
But getting caught up in how you look and how you are living, where you live, what you drive, your job, where your kids go to school.
Right.
Falling into that trap was very easy. And getting to a point where none of the issues that I was dealing with personally were getting any better, no matter if all of those other things were taken care of. And getting to a point where I realized that I loved the people I worked with, but I was unfulfilled. And I started really looking at the motives behind that. And a big part of that was spirituality. Part of that was wanting to be able to build my own company. Mm-hmm. And but I spent a lot of time as I was navigating that decision on making a responsible decision as it related to my family and my faith, and making sure I wasn't being selfish as I evaluated becoming an entrepreneur. All that to say is it was the entrepreneurial journey for me, which leaving the corporate world, starting my own company, and really from a faith perspective, being in a place, being on a high that I'd never been before. Right. And that was through some spiritual mentors that I had, and really looking at my own walk. And then coming to a place with the business where things didn't pan out in the timeline that I thought they were going to pan out, and really experiencing depression, clinical depression, seeing a psychologist, a psychiatrist, medication, the whole nine. Being in a place and coping with clinical depression, where going up here spiritually to down here in the darkest place I've ever been. And really, one of those spiritual mentors said to me one day, we used to have breakfast every week, and in the midst of the depression, he looked at me and he said, you realize when you're up here spiritually and you're flinging arrows on behalf of God, you can't be surprised when the arrows start coming back at you. And that really...
All right, good.
Coming from a military background, that really resonated.
Of course it did.
But it also scared the pants off of me.
Well, all right. And, sometimes fear is an appropriate motivator too, isn't it?
Yes.
We sometimes talk in a sort of braggadocious way about how we have no fear and we're going to be fearless and all of that, but actually confronting fear and attending to it is part of the key to spirituality, because yes, perfect love casts out fear, the scripture says, but you've got to be aware of fear to begin with before you can address it.
I would tell you, I never have known fear like I did and have known in the midst of a few bouts of depression. And fear so much so that it was everything I could do to get out of bed and to get into my vehicle and to drive to the office.
Wow.
So much so that I remember coming in, and I had an employee or two at the time, and they're working very, very hard. And I would come in, and we all shared one room, a few different desks, and I would come in and sit down with my back to them, and their back was to me, and I would just peck on the keyboard and pretend like I was responding to email.
Wow.
But the fear was for me...
Just immobilizing. Completely immobilizing.
Completely immobilized. I was so scared. I had never been in a place before where I had no experience. In this business, I had no experience. I was being asked to make decisions that I didn't know what was right, what was wrong, or at least being able to bounce off somebody.
Right.
And so that fear of not wanting to make the wrong decision, I literally shut down for...
And I think people would be surprised to hear you say, I've never known fear like that, when you were in some of the worst hotspots in the world as a Navy SEAL, in the most dangerous places possible.
Well, the great thing about that situation is the amount of training that happens, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
The amount of training that happens, not only that you're training individually, more importantly, the amount of training that happens with 16 or 30 other guys around you. So you're in a situation that you have prepared for ad nauseum thousands and thousands and thousands of times, and at that point you're reacting.
Right, right.
It's muscle memory, and you're with a bunch of guys.
Okay, but this really...
In that situation, as an entrepreneur, I was by myself in a situation
Right.
I had never...
Okay, so this really is such a crucial point, I think, about faith, right? And spirituality, and that is, it can only be yours, but it's not a solitary journey. So I think so many people think that everyone's faith is private, and everyone's faith is, it is personal, but this is a community activity. I mean, this is absolutely crucial that if we're going to sustain faith over time, we have to do it with others.
Yeah, going back to Ecclesiastes, right?
Yes, right. Mm-hmm.
Two is better than one. If one falls down, the second one can pull them up. And that, for me,
Yes.
as an entrepreneur, was where I was short-sighted.
Yes.
In not having, and I would make the same decision today, but reflecting on it, where I really struggled was I didn't have someone else,
A mentor.
from a business perspective, sitting
Right.
there with me to commiserate. When you
Right.
get kicked in the teeth, you can
Yes.
at least look at each other
Okay.
and go, man, that sucked.
Right, right.
And so from a faith perspective, being in a place where I felt very isolated,
Yes.
and it took me a while to have the courage to get back up and say, and a lot of this comes through a wife who literally looked at me and said, I give you permission to go do this. Not only that, but if you lose every dime, because I risk every dime we'd ever save.
Right, you left a very successful year in commercial real estate, the most successful you had had.
I had about an 8-year career, and the year before I left was a phenomenal year. The problem was everything that I had made and made that year in 2014, I was spending it as fast to try and further this company that I was building.
Which we should say Six Site.
Which was Six Site. And
yes.
I had a wife who looked at me and said, you can go do this because you will regret it if you don't. And at the risk of losing our home, our cars, everything else that is quote unquote important, she looked at me and she said, as long as we have each other and we got a healthy marriage and we got 5 healthy kids, we'll figure the rest out.
Right.
And that for me was very liberating.
Liberating, yeah.
But
because now, again, you have support. You have a community.
Yes, but having the courage. So she told me all that, and then through a series of events, the depression started. And literally, I would come home every day, and I would see my kids come home every day after not doing. If I answered one email, it was a good day. I didn't answer my phone unless it was her or a few, maybe 3 or 4 other people that knew what I was dealing with. But I would come home and I would look at my wife, and I would see these 5 kids, and everybody's happy and playing, and the guilt of, you just wasted 8 hours at work and you sent one email, and all these 5 kids are depending on you.
Yes.
The guilt that comes with just having the courage to, because of my wife's encouragement, to not quit. And her, I'll never forget, I'd come home and be in tears and say, I sent one email today, and she'd go, you know what, tomorrow why don't you try to send 2?
Wow.
And the daily...
Incredible.
The daily grind of climbing out of that. Well, once I sent 2, hey, try to send 3 emails and maybe make 1 phone call. It was that level of debilitating fear.
So I think we're going to take a break for a moment and talk a little bit about Carry the Load and promote that nonprofit of which you are CEO and co-founder. But when we come back, I want to talk more about depression and how we understand it from a faith perspective and how you learned to deal with vulnerability.
Good God salutes Carry the Load, dedicated to providing active, meaningful ways to honor and celebrate the sacrifices made by our nation's heroes, military, law enforcement, firefighters, rescue personnel, and their families 365 days a year.
Stephen, we were talking about depression, and I think a lot of people of faith have a hard time accepting that people can get clinically depressed and that is an actual illness that people experience, a kind of challenge that is about chemistry as well as circumstances and pressure and stress and all of that. And it's not a spiritual failing to deal with that, and yet it feels like it to people in depression, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
So what did you learn about yourself going through this that you could share with people about the experience of depression? Because if so many people are touched by it in some way or another.
So part of my journey in the midst of not being able to really function on any level, I remember spending days at my desk when I wasn't pretending to be on email. I would write out prayer. What I was asking for was, God, please tell me what the right decision is here. Continue down this road that could mean financial failure and complete embarrassment to me and my family on this risk that I've taken, or do I keep at it? And of course, what I'm looking for and what I'm rationalizing in that place is God's going to say, do this, or He's going to say, do this. Well, right? That's not faith.
Doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work that way. Right. But when you're in an irrational mind, day after day, I was thinking, okay, God's going to tell me today.
Right.
If I pray long enough, well, where I came back to was, for me, getting out of that place, a large part of that was going, all right, you're not going to give me the answer, but I'm going to have the faith to keep going, and no matter what happens, it's out of my hands. And you're going to provide one way or another. And provide doesn't mean I'm going to get to keep the car and the house and whatever else, right? But we're not going to starve.
Right.
And we're going to figure it out.
Right.
And slowly coming out of that.
But you got help to come out of it. It wasn't just all of a sudden deciding, right?
You bet. It was people that came around me, my wife being among them, some other people that said, we really believe in what you're trying to do here. And whether it was manpower that I didn't put on the payroll, or whether it was resources to continue to get to a point in the business where I could go raise money, I had a lot of help.
Right.
And it was when I finally was okay accepting the help.
Accepting help, Stephen. This is something that's so hard for so many people.
We can be very prideful.
Yes.
But when I finally said, okay, you know what?
Right.
I'm willing to accept whatever help. Because initially when people would offer help, I felt so bad that I'm not going to be able to pay this back, or
there you go.
This company's going to be gone in 6 months,
right.
And the guilt. But when I was finally able to accept help, that's when things really started to turn around. And I think you mentioned it earlier in 2 Corinthians, maybe, when Paul's talking about
in my weakness,
I am strong.
Then I am strong. And this is something that you write about in your blog about depression that I think is important, and people can find that on the Sick Site.
Yes, I think, and again,
website.
Writing through our content and social media, our creative team and our marketing team said, you need to start coming out with a blog weekly, monthly. Write whatever you want to write, and not, It just so happened that when I sat on a plane to write the blog that day, it was about, okay, I can keep pretending that I've got this thing figured out and I've got it all together, and people look at me and carry the load, and our business is doing pretty good, and 5 kids and a good marriage, and think I got it all figured out. Let me just tell you, that burden of that facade and that mask is extremely hard to carry. And so me writing that blog was essentially a way to say, the mask is coming off,
right.
And I want people to know, and again, having friends that have wrestled with depression and made decisions to end their lives, and I kick myself for not writing it sooner.
Sure.
Hopefully, in an effort to let, whether it's guys and gals that served in the military or whether they didn't, everybody is struggling with something. So for me, being very open and honest and transparent and writing about depression and the vulnerability and the need to ask for help, hopefully, if nothing else, someone will read that and go, you know what, I'm not alone, and it's okay to say, I need help.
I think another misconception about depression is there are these incredibly dark periods that people go through and are diagnosable clinical depression. You get the help you need, you start pulling out, you're able to get some perspective, and then I think people think, okay, I've conquered depression. I'm finished with this now, right?
I made that miscalculation.
All right, keep going. Tell us more about that.
My first bout with depression in 2016 lasted about 4.5 months before I was able to get to a point where, again, I had no category for depression. I would look at people that committed suicide or talked about depression, and I selfishly, I thought, how could you do that?
Right.
In the midst of depression, that decision made sense. Not something that I was willing to do, but something I thought about and thought, you know what? In the midst of this, that irrationality, that is
the world will be better without me. Other people won't be as burdened by my.
You bet.
All those sorts of things.
And so I came out of it, and then in 2017, I went through it again. But this time, instead of lasting 4.5 months, it lasted almost 9 months.
Wow.
And I made the miscalculation coming out of it the first time. I don't need this medication anymore. That's in the rearview mirror.
Right.
And then it happened again, and I went back to the psychologist regularly, the psychiatrist, went back on the medication, and it took me a lot longer to climb out. But where, at least now, and again, I'm not arrogant enough to think that it's never going to happen again. But going into it with both eyes wide open, it's having been in that spot, I at least know what it looks like and feels like, and know that I've come out of it twice.
So to just help people a little bit to deal with, how does their faith help them to address their depression if they find themselves in this place? You mentioned that there's not a magical sort of prayer, that God doesn't just come in and do something, but in fact, God actually works through doctors and medicine and family members and support groups and sponsors and all these sorts of things. When you think faith, sometimes people think it's all an immediate black and white thing, but it's all these ways that God gives us to find our way through, not around.
You're exactly right. And whether it's all those things that you mentioned, and again, it's the willingness to say, okay, I can't do this on my own.
Right.
And I don't know what tomorrow's going to bring, but I'm going to go throughout this day having faith that you're sitting right here with me, and whatever comes, you're sitting here. Right. And again, I had a really good friend of mine, another mentor on several different levels, who had battled depression, said to me one day when I was evaluating medication and this, that, and the other, he said, just realize there's no magic pill. It's not like you start taking this and tomorrow.
Right.
He said, the best analogy I can give you is you're 4 weeks from now, you're going to wake up and you're going to reflect back on the last 4 weeks, and you go, you know what? I don't feel quite as bad as I did a month ago. And it'll be little moments like that where one day you'll look up and go, I feel pretty good.
Okay.
I think when you boil it all down, it's the willingness to ask for help, one, whether that's most certainly God, and having the faith to let go.
Let go. Okay.
Right?
Take your hands off the wheel.
That's a scary place to be, but let go and let those in your life, whether it's your doctors, your family, your mentors, people in your business. And I could talk for an hour over the last 2 years about all those aspects, in addition to things that happened in my business that were inexplainable.
So in other words, what happens is you learn to wake up to the gifts of life that start coming to you. When you're in depression, there's this sense of blackness, right? This sense that nothing good is happening, that the world is sinking and you're sinking with it. And maybe other people are experiencing something different, but not for you. But then you start to be able to wake up to these are blessings. There are good things happening, and you start living into them, huh?
Again, it is taking the little moments of, again, for me, in the midst of depression, sleep was really my only reprieve, because it was when my mind wasn't being irrational.
Right.
So getting up in the morning was extremely hard, and staying awake at night. Like when I got home from work, hang out with the kids, I wanted to go to bed.
Wow.
Because I wanted to shut this off.
Wow.
So getting out of bed in the morning and sitting down with the kids before school and actually enjoying having breakfast. And again, I hated, and I hate to say that, but I hated driving my old two kids to school because I was so scared, because right after that, I had to drive to work. I loved driving them to school. I hated the anticipation of, you're done stalling, you got to get to the office.
Yes.
And I felt so guilty that my oldest two kids picked up on that.
Right. And they did, huh? Yeah.
Yes, they did. And so all that's to say is it's the willingness to see the little bitty blessings, and at a very foundational level, it's you can't give up, and you got to continue to fight. You have to continue to fight.
So you're fighting, and in your business, you came up with this hashtag.
Right.
Hashtag find it.
Right.
So say how that was a trigger for you to help you find it. What does hashtag find it mean?
So very early on in this business, again, hunting, outdoor, kind of adventure apparel and gear. And for whatever reason, one of our creative director came up with this hashtag of find it. And it was, best I can equate it to is the same as Nike's just do it, right?
Okay.
Find it. But we couldn't really articulate anything else around it, but it really resonated with me. This past year, I was in my psychologist's office, and she was talking about the brain's seeking system and our natural antidepressant when we are out exploring, seeking, trying to find,
there you go.
learning, bettering our minds,
Right.
venturing into the unknown.
Okay.
And she said, that is your natural antidepressant. That's your brain's way of battling the mundane or depression. And she literally said, you have to continue to find it or keep. That's what she said, and the light bulb went off. And I thought, that's why we chose that hashtag.
Right.
Again, it has a lot of different meanings to a lot of different people, but for me, in the midst of depression, that's why it was chosen.
Well, let's connect it to faith. And the idea of hashtag find it, to me, suggests that there is a certain adventure in the life of faith that is filled with hope and future. And when you're in depression, you can't see that light. You can't see beyond the moment. And faith is always about what's next, isn't it?
It is. And what I think is so hard, it was hard for me, when you let go of the steering wheel and you sit back and go, all right, I don't know what today's going to bring. There's a lot of fear in doing that, because you're not in control anymore. But when the blessing, and again, it's not all going to be blessings. The challenges are going to happen, the heartache's going to happen. But when the blessings happen that come out of left field, and that happens with regularity, and in the midst of your faith and growing stronger and trusting in God, that for me is the adventure.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
To put it very bluntly, the adventure of not being able to predict what is going to happen that day.
But trusting God for it.
But trusting God for it, that's not only going to bless your life, but it is going to bless others' lives as well.
Beautiful.
That's the adventure of faith.
Terrific.
And it all starts when you go, all right,
Well, Stephen,
I'm not driving.
Thank you for the vulnerability, for the honesty. I think many people might look to a person like you with a resume as a SEAL, as an athlete, an entrepreneur, and identify with your weakness as much as your strength. And you've been transparent with us about that, and we thank you for sharing, and I know it's healing for many.
Thank you for having me.
God bless you, friend. Okay.
Good God salutes Carry the Load, dedicated to providing active, meaningful ways to honor and celebrate the sacrifices made by our nation's heroes, military, law enforcement, firefighters, rescue personnel, and their families 365 days a year.